Joining me now is Northwestern professor of law, Michael Kang. And Devin, is he still there? I heard a little dial tone. Oh, okay. All right. Scared me there. He is the co-author with Joanna Shepard of a book called Free to Judge, The Power of Campaign Money in Judicial Elections. There is a lot riding on the Supreme Court right now, so what a perfect time to talk with Michael Kang. Michael, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Joe.
You know, I heard last night from the many pundits until my hair spontaneously combusted and I had to shut the television off. I heard from many people that the courts, Democrats are counting on the courts. The courts are going to save us. And yet we have, by all accounts, an exceedingly partisan, exceedingly presidential-friendly Supreme Court. Do you think the Democrats who say that are being overly optimistic?
I think sometimes they're being a little optimistic. We have a really hyper-partisan political system right now. Certainly you're right that Congress isn't going to stop the president. It's a little uncertain how much of a check the courts are going to provide on the president. I think there are probably experts and pundits are right to think that the courts are more resistant to executive power and specifically Donald Trump. They've shown in the past, for example, in the election cases, where they're willing to stand up for the law and uphold process over just raw politics. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of the same forces that influence Congress and state politics influence the federal judiciary, too. I think it's fair to say that federal judges are probably more aware of what's going on nationally in politics and perhaps more sensitive to those politics. And that, I think, in the end, probably does affect the way they think about cases. It doesn't mean in the end that they're going to side with their party on all the cases. I think that's almost certainly not going to be true. There are going to be some cases where, for instance, conservative Republican judges and justices are going to disagree with the Trump administration's position on things. But I think it is fair to worry about the problem that there seems to be a lot of cohesion, really on both sides, among Democrats and Republicans. And Republican and Democratic judges, I think today, are more likely to kind of side with their party than maybe they were 50 years ago, where ideology was less important and the system was less polarized. So I think we'll have to see, and I think it may depend on the specific kind of case that comes before the court in figuring out where they land.
Okay, that makes sense. But one of the things that Donald Trump seems to have been toying with recently is simply ignoring court rulings he doesn't like. I believe some of the firings, the courts have said, no, you don't have the standing to do those firings. Those people are not fired. Programs, agencies, no, there's a process that has to go through before something like this is shut down. You didn't go through the process, so everything is on hold. But, like some of the Head Start programs around the country that had their funding stopped and then restarted by the courts are still sending out letters to their parents saying, we have to close because the portal where we get our payments is still not available to us. So right. Even if something gets up to the Supreme Court, even if the Supreme Court finally says no to Donald Trump in some capacity, who's going to enforce it?
Yeah, it's a real problem in our constitutional system. I mean, it's often said that, courts are the weakest branch because they don't have a way to enforce their judgments. They depend on legitimacy and they depend on the other political actors to respect their authority. And this is what people are calling a potential constitutional crisis. I don't think we've reached quite that point quite yet, where the Trump administration is openly defying courts, but they certainly are making a lot of noises about it. And I think it's a real worry. And I think you're also right to point out that in very quiet ways, they're already doing that. They're already defying or making it hard for courts to get their authority heard in our system. And it's not clear exactly what would happen if the Trump administration just says, no, we're just not going to follow. That would be a real constitutional crisis where it's not clear who should do what at that point, because the courts really don't have an enforcement authority. They can't send the police to force the federal government to do anything. And at that point, I don't know what the right answers are.
What do we as a country do? Is that when, if there's, if Donald Trump wants to do something really bad and the courts say no and he says, stick it, what do we do? What do we do? Is that when we take to the streets?
In a way, yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the way we've traditionally thought about that sort of challenge is that there are political remedies, that the next election, Donald Trump doesn't get reelected. Obviously, that is not necessarily going to be the case. I think Trump's talked about a third term, but he's constitutionally barred from running again. And that's, I think, given him a certain kind of freedom, at least in his own mind, to do what he wants and not worry about consequences. But maybe other political actors would worry about their own reelection chances and where the Republican Party stands if the Trump administration openly defies the law and does things that are clearly illegitimate. Then we would hope at least people would get really angry about it and worried about our political system and punish Republicans politically. You've seen a little bit of that in some of the pushback at these town halls that Republican officials have had, where voters seem pretty angry about DOGE and all of these cuts to the federal government that people don't feel that they voted for. So I think if we get to the point where the Trump administration is just openly defying court orders and doing things that are illegal, we'd have to hope that other political actors feel a lot of pressure to stand up for the law, and that we as a citizenry kind of stand up and force them to do that and make it clear we won't stand for it. But our system is really not designed for courts to have to try to enforce their decisions. And I think courts are really wary about that. They know they can't enforce their decisions. And so sometimes, historically speaking, sometimes they don't challenge political actors that they think won't respect their decisions because they don't want to look neutered. They don't want to lose. Exactly. Yeah, it makes them look bad, and it weakens their institutional authority kind of going forward. So I think that's as big a worry as anything, is not just that the Trump administration won't respect their decisions, but that they'll scale back and maybe make decisions with the worry about Trump defiance in mind, and maybe not do the right thing and uphold the law in ways that we'd expect them to, because they're worried about Trump flouting their decisions. And that's as big a worry as, the Trump administration just openly defying those decisions.
Well, everybody always says about how they're appointed for life so they can do whatever they want to do, but they really do react to public sentiment. I mean, they're human beings. How could they not? But I could see, I could see somebody like Donald Trump communicating privately to them, you better rule this way, because if not, I'm going to defy you, and people are going to understand just how powerless you are. I could see that sort of, that seems very within the realm of possibility.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump is someone who relishes power and enjoys exercising it and really making people feel small and feel they're really subject to his will. He's not shy about it at all. And so I think you're right. I think he's said in the past how he expects the Supreme Court, his justices to decide things, his judges to decide things, especially I think at the lower court level where maybe there's a hope that they can advance professionally, from district court to court of appeals to the Supreme Court. You've actually seen that, a Fifth Circuit judge who was very strongly in support of birthright citizenship has kind of very publicly reversed his position in ways that seem inexplicable, other than he wants to curry favor with the president and maybe get appointed to the Supreme Court someday. So I think all of those things are true. I mean, there are judges who want to have Trump like them because he might reward them, and then there's judges that worry about what Trump will do and worry about the kind of punishments that he might be able to inflict. It's hard to do that against federal judges. As you said, they have lifetime appointments, and they're politically insulated. But Donald Trump is not shy about trying to make life bad for his enemies or people he feel like are in his way, and he can put a lot of political pressure on the court in the way he talks about things and rallies his supporters against and for people. And so I do think that the justices probably do feel some pressure to decide things in his direction. And really the internal pressures within the Republican Party are very intense to sort of do the team thing. You see that for sure in Congress, where I think people talk differently depending on whether they're in private and public. They have very different views about Trump, whether you talk to them in private or public. And a lot of that is because of the politics, that Trump is not shy about exerting this kind of pressure to get what he wants. And I don't think justices are exempt from that. They're a little more insulated, but they're not exempt from it.
When in the early days of me doing this show, there was a Republican lawyer who I used to have on periodically, and I stopped inviting him to be on the radio because I realized that he wasn't being truthful. He wasn't like a super loud, Trump or die kind of guy, but he definitely would support the Republican talking points of the minute. And then when we were off the air, he would acknowledge how awful and crazy it all was. And, once I gave him a pass, but when it happened a second time, I was like, you know what? I didn't create this kind of a radio show so that people could be hypocritical, essentially, so that they could, just like they do, drives me crazy when I see a Republican speaking on CNN and they say something that just begs to be challenged. There was a woman, Republican Congresswoman, speaking on CNN this morning who was talking about all the gangs and the terrorists coming across the border from Canada. And I started yelling. I don't do this very often, but I was yelling at the television, and I was like, for God's sakes, interrupt her. Make her, at the very least, make her double down on that. And make her acknowledge what she just said and make her stick to it. Make her live with it. And, I can't, I can't stand that. And there's so much of that right now because there are very few people, I think, who are really at the upper levels of power who are really MAGA. I think they're mostly just opportunistic. What's good for me today? Where do I need to be today? The Lindsey Graham School of Politics. Michael, we need to take a break. I'm talking to author and Northwestern professor of law, Michael Kang. We'll be back after this.
Joan Esposito, live.
Celebrating our power to bring about change.
Local.
Everybody has to work together.
And progressive.
I think you get the idea.
On WCPT 820.
I'm joined by Michael Kang, author and Northwestern professor of law. And Michael, I've got part of one of your bios in front of me, and it talks about the areas where you do research. And one of the things listed is you do research into sore loser laws. I've never heard that phrase before, and I would love for you to tell me what it means.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm one of the very few people who write about sore loser laws at all. So I'm the right person to talk to. They're not well known, so it's not surprised if the most politically sophisticated people know or don't know about them. But basically, they're laws that make it very difficult or outright prohibit someone who loses a party primary from running in the general election. So you run in the Democratic primary, you lose, and you want to run as an independent or maybe as a nominee of another party, a minor party in the general election anyway. This has happened a few times in states where you don't have a sore loser law.
Like I want to, the Dems didn't want me, but I'm now going to run with the Green Party.
Exactly. Yeah. Joe Lieberman did this in Connecticut. it doesn't happen very often because you're sort of turning your back on the party. But on the other hand, they voted you out, so you should have the chance to run. But it is very hard to run as the sore loser. And in fact, they're called sore loser laws as a sort of derogatory term, that these are sore losers. They've lost the primary and they get to run in the general election. But I did some work on this, both empirically and theoretically. And what we find is that those laws are associated with more extreme politics. And the reason is the primaries tend to be controlled by the party bases that tend to be a little bit more ideologically extreme. And when you lose in the primary, often they can be moderate candidates like Lieberman, and they're blocked from running in the general election. And so it tends to filter out moderate candidates. If you get rid of the sore loser laws, sometimes those moderate candidates that lose in the primary are able to run in the general election, sometimes as an independent. And that moderates politics to some degree, because a lot of times in today's environment, the most viable kind of sore losers are more moderate candidates that get filtered out in our kind of hyper-partisan environment. So people hadn't studied this, and I looked at it, and it turns out it has a reasonably large effect on polarization. So if you're worried about extreme politics, getting rid of sore loser laws, it's not a total solution, but it helps a little bit.
I see.
And when we looked at this empirically, it seemed to matter.
That's really fascinating. It makes perfect sense, because I mean, how many times recently have we heard of Democrats and Republicans surreptitiously funding the campaigns of people from another party because they think in the general election that person will be easier to beat. Most recently, like Jeff Jackson ran for attorney general in North Carolina, and a Republican PAC started funneling money to the guy in his own party who was primarying him. And he called it out. He was like, look, this is where the money's coming from. Clearly, they do not want to run their candidate up against me. And of course, he has an incredible reach with social media. He was able to withstand that kind of a primary challenge. But we've seen it here in Illinois sometimes when there's a moderate Republican and a radical Republican, and we tend to be a more Democratic state. So sometimes people will do things to try to support the more radical Republican because they know they will be easier to defeat in a general election.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been controversial. I think the Democratic Party and Democratic sponsors have sometimes done that. And I think there's some hand-wringing within the Democratic Party about whether that's the right thing to do, to kind of mess with the other party's primary and kind of play those tricks that I think Democrats have tended to pride themselves in not doing. Whether they're right or not, who knows? But that has tended to be the way that Democrats think about how to play politics. And that's been a recent trend where Democrats have seemed to succeed doing that. If you think about the most moderate Republican senator right now, it's Lisa Murkowski, and she ran as a sore loser. She lost in the Republican primary. This is a while back, but managed to win in the general election as a write-in candidate, which is very hard to do. But that's one example of a fairly moderate Republican who would have lost and been filtered out of the system in the Republican primary, which tends to be pretty extreme, and was able to run the general election, is actually more appealing to the general election electorate than the Republican primary voters. Yeah. And it can happen on the Democratic side too.
Yeah, I remember a while back locally there was a candidate for Water Reclamation District, one of my favorite things to vote for. And for some reason, I don't know if he was too late to the party or what, but for some reason he did not get slated. And there was this huge campaign to put him down on your ballot as a write-in, and he won one of the seats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the primary is one way that our politics has gotten more extreme, is because the voters in the party primaries are more extreme on both sides, on both the Democratic and the Republican side, and they want candidates that are more extreme. And And that's fine. But what's happened systemically is when you've got these primary voters demanding more conservative Republicans and more progressive Democrats on both sides, the system as a whole becomes more extreme, and it becomes harder for them to work together. And so I think, getting rid of the sore loser law is a pretty modest reform. It's not transformational, but it can be a good thing, because I think when I think about American politics today, so many of the problems we have are from hyperpartisanship, that the parties really kind of think of themselves as teams that can't work with the other side at all, and often will forego gains, compromises that would be good for both sides, because they don't want to hand the other side a victory. And that, when President Obama was in the White House, Mitch McConnell's what he said at the very beginning of Obama's presidency was, we want to deny him a second term. Like, that's our goal, And when your goal is something like that, you're not going to work with the other side, and everything's going to be party line. Sometimes it makes sense to do things party line. You've got your principles, and you have to stand up for them. And I think that's where the Democratic Party right now is vis-a-vis Donald Trump. I think if you're a Democrat, you should feel really strongly about opposing and resisting what Trump's doing, because it's a fairly extreme agenda. So it's not that you have to work with the other side, but there are ways we can make the system more better for moderates who do have the support of voters, and not let party voters necessarily filter them out in the primary.
Michael, why does it seem like, this is sort of a technical question, why does it seem like some Supreme Court decisions are made very quickly and released? Others, they keep them under wraps till the last possible minute. Is it just sort of whatever they feel like doing on a given day?
Well, the Supreme Court, as we've discussed, has got a lot of political insulation and a lot of discretion over what they do. There's very few cases that they have to take. They take most of their cases.
No, but I mean the cases they take and the cases they hear. It seems like sometimes you get a decision right away, and then other times it's like this big mystery when it will come.
And sometimes it's very strategic. I mean, if you think about the Trump prosecutions, they really let that string out, and they could have decided what ultimately was the Trump versus Anderson decision that gave him immunity. And we've discussed this before on the air.
And when Jack Smith went to them and said, look, I'm doing this case, it's eventually going to end up before you. Let's cut to the chase. Give us your ruling right now. And they were like, oh, no, we're going to let the process work itself out.
Yeah, and I understand sometimes that makes sense, but in that case, it meant that really the prosecution wasn't going to succeed, right? It ran into the election, and then ultimately Trump won. So is that politics? Is that just being careful and, managing the process in a really thoughtful way? I think it's hard to.
Can I answer that? Can I answer that, Michael? Please, oh please, oh please! It's politics.
Right. I mean, it's hard to conclude otherwise that that's not part of it. I think in that case they probably didn't want to decide the case if they didn't have to, and they were fine with it if the prosecution ran out of time. I think probably the justices, they really don't want to appear political, but sometimes it's becoming unavoidable to conclude when they are.
Yeah. Michael Kang, author and professor of law from Northwestern. Michael, thank you so much for answering some of my legitimate and some of my silly questions.
Thank you, Joan.